The morning mist clung to the West Virginia mountains like a familiar embrace, as Eleanor Morgan Ellie, to the few who knew her well, stepped onto her cabin's weathered porch. At 42, she moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had walked mountain paths for years, though the dark circles under her eyes betrayed nights spent staring at bills spread across the kitchen table. Steam rose from her coffee mug, warming her face against the early autumn chill, as Shadow, her 10-year-old German shepherd, stretched beside her, his dark coat glistening with dew. 3 years had passed since Robert's death, but the weight of his absence still pressed against her chest each morning. The official report called it an accident, a hiking mishap on treacherous terrain, but something in the investigator's eyes had always bothered her, a flicker of something unspoken. The memory of it still gnawed at her during quiet moments when Jake was asleep, and the mountain's silence became too heavy. Inside, pots clanged against the sink. Jake was up early again, trying to make breakfast without waking her. At 12, her son carried a seriousness beyond his years. The move to these mountains had been hard on him, leaving friends behind, starting a new school where he was the new kid with no dad. She watched through the window as he meticulously measured pancake mix, his face set in concentration so much like Robert's, it made her breath catch. Ellie sipped her coffee, scanning the tree line for the 100th time. The sensation of being watched had grown stronger in recent weeks. She'd dismissed it initially as paranoia, the natural wariness that comes from living alone with a child in remote woodland. But something felt different lately, little things out of place in the cabin. A window she was certain she'd locked found unlatched. Footprints in the soft earth near the generator shed that neither she nor Jake had made. Shadow's ears perked suddenly, his body tensing beside her. The dog's instincts had saved her life more than once during her firefighting days. When Shadow sensed danger, Ellie had learned to pay attention. The cabin door creaked open behind her, and Jake stepped onto the porch, spatula still in hand. His dark hair stuck up in places, desperately needing a trim. The pancake batter had left a smudge on his Star Wars t-shirt. He'd grown 2 inches over the summer pants, already too short at the ankles. Another expense she'd have to figure out. Jake announced breakfast was ready, eyes brightening when she ruffled his hair. For a moment, he was just a normal 12-year-old, not the quiet, watchful child who had barely spoken for months after the funeral. The pancakes would be lumpy and slightly undercooked in the middle, they always were, but she'd eat every bite and praise his improving technique. Inside, she spotted the worn leather notebook tucked half beneath his school backpack. Jake had found it wedged behind a loose board in the cabin's mudroom last week, a relic from previous owners, perhaps. She'd only glimpsed a few pages, weather observations, terrain notes, and something called Project Clearwater scrawled repeatedly in the margins. Just another mountain mystery, she'd thought, though Jake had become oddly fixated on it, carrying it everywhere. After breakfast, Ellie laid out their plans for the day trail, maintenance volunteer work she'd signed up for months ago, part of her efforts to integrate into the community. Jake groaned theatrically, but his eyes betrayed excitement. Their mother-son days in the forest had become sacred time moments, when the weight of everything they'd lost seemed to lift briefly from their shoulders. The mountain trails needed clearing after recent storms had scattered branches and debris across hiking paths. As a volunteer trail maintainer, Ellie found purpose in the physical labor, in knowing her work made these wild places accessible to others. The Park Service appreciated her background as both firefighter and EMT, someone who could handle emergencies in remote locations if hikers got into trouble. They packed simple gear, work gloves, loppers, Jake's pocket knife, a recent birthday gift that had prompted lengthy discussions about responsibility, water bottles, and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Shadow circled their legs excitedly as they prepared, sensing adventure ahead. The woodland trail began where their property met the state forest, marked by a weathered wooden sign. September had painted the forest in transitional colors, some trees beginning to flame with autumn reds and yellows, while others clung stubbornly to summer green. The earth smelled rich with decomposition and renewal, a scent Ellie had come to associate with possibility. Jake ranged ahead on the trail, Shadow trotting at his side. The boy had memorized bird calls over the summer, pointing out warblers and thrushes to Ellie with growing confidence. She watched him navigate roots and rocks with the agility of youth, reminding herself that not everything had been lost when Robert died. Jake carried his father's curiosity about the natural world, his methodical approach to problems. They worked steadily through the morning, clearing fallen branches, noting areas where water runoff had damaged trail edges. Ellie demonstrated how to create proper drainage channels, Jake absorbing the lesson with intensity. His questions grew increasingly technical. Robert's influence again. Her late husband had taught their son to understand systems, to see how each part connected to the whole. By midday, they'd cleared nearly half a mile of trail. Ellie called for a lunch break beside a small stream where flat rocks provided natural seating. Jake produced his ever-present notebook while scribbling observations and sketching leaves. Shadow patrolled the perimeter of their sunspot before settling at Jake's feet, accepting scraps of turkey with dignified restraint. After lunch, they continued deeper into the forest toward a section of trail Ellie hadn't maintained before. The terrain grew steeper, the underbrush thicker. Shadow suddenly darted ahead, disappearing into dense ferns, with Jake following close behind, calling for Ellie to hurry. She rounded a bend to find Jake crouched beside Shadow at the base of a moss-covered hill. The dog was pawing frantically at the ground, soft whines escaping his throat. Jake's face showed a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Jake pointed to something partially exposed in the disturbed earth, a glint of metal dull with age and corrosion, but distinctly unnatural among the forest debris. Ellie knelt beside them, brushing away loose soil with her gloved hands. The shape became clearer, a flat metal panel with what appeared to be hinges along one edge. Shadow's behavior shifted from curious to wary, backing away while maintaining a low growl. The dog's reaction sent a chill up Ellie's spine. Shadow was trained to investigate, not retreat. Whatever lay beneath the moss and soil triggered something primal in the animal's instincts. Jake's excitement overrode any caution. He began clearing more moss and dirt, revealing the unmistakable outline of a door set into the hillside. Decades of forest growth had nearly reclaimed it, making it practically invisible to casual hikers. Only Shadow's keen senses and their deliberate trail clearing had exposed it. Ellie's first instinct was to pull Jake away. Underground structures in these mountains could be dangerous, abandoned mine shafts, forgotten storm shelters, collapsed moonshine stills from Prohibition days. But Jake's determined expression stopped her. Finding common ground with her son had been difficult since the move. His discovery clearly mattered to him. Together, they cleared more debris from the door, revealing a heavy steel surface with no visible handle or keyhole. The construction was sophisticated, not the rough work of local mountain engineering. This had been professionally installed and deliberately concealed. Jake connected the door to his notebook, immediately pointing out a hand-drawn map he'd found in its pages that marked this approximate location with a small X and the notation, Site C Access. The coincidence was too precise to dismiss. Ellie examined the door more carefully, applying pressure at different points. Years of professional rescue training had taught her to assess structures methodically. The door appeared sealed by both rust and an internal locking mechanism. Without proper tools opening, it would be impossibly dangerous. She explained to Jake they would need to return better equipped, making it a project rather than abandoning it entirely. His face lit up at the prospect, their shared secret creating a bond that had been fragile since Robert's death. Ellie took photos with her phone, marking their location on her trail map. Shadow remained uncomfortable, refusing to approach the door despite Jake's encouragement. The dog's behavior troubled Ellie more than she let on. Shadow had been through forest fires, flood rescues, and mountain searches without showing fear. Whatever lay beyond that steel barrier triggered something deeper than caution in him. They continued their trail maintenance, though Jake's focus had clearly shifted. Every few minutes, he referenced his notebook, comparing landmarks to sketches inside. The coincidence bothered Ellie. How had this notebook with a map leading to a hidden door ended up in their cabin? The previous owner had been an elderly woman who sold the property through her children after moving to Florida. Nothing about the transaction had suggested mystery. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they headed home. Jake bubbled with theories about the door, military, bunker, secret government facility, Cold War relic. His imagination, dormant since Robert's death, had suddenly reawakened. Ellie found herself caught between maternal caution and relief at seeing a spark return to her son. That night, after Jake went to bed, Ellie retrieved his notebook from the kitchen table where he'd left it. Ethical concerns about invading his privacy warred with her need to understand what they'd discovered. Professional caution won out. If they were going back to that door, she needed all available information. The notebook contained more than childish observations. Among Jake's recent entries were careful transcriptions of what appeared to be military-style notes, coordinates, supply inventories, personnel rotations. and repeated references to Project Clearwater alongside the designation Site C. The handwriting in the original sections was precise, adult, and somehow familiar, though she couldn't place it. A loose page fell from between the notebook's binding, a newspaper clipping yellowed with age. The headline read, "Federal Task Force Established to Combat Rural Crime." The photo showed 5 men in suits standing before the county courthouse. The date, October 1993, 30 years ago. One face had been circled in faded red ink. Ellie stared at the image, a cold certainty forming in her stomach. The circled man wasn't familiar, but standing 2 positions away was a younger version of Sheriff Frank Cooper Sr., whose son now served as county sheriff. Another man she recognized as the retired Dr. Lawrence, who still lived in town. The remaining faces weren't immediately familiar, but the configuration of officials suggested authority and influence. She returned everything to Jake's backpack, her mind racing. The hidden door, the notebook with coordinates, the marked photograph, all suggested something deliberately concealed. Her firefighter training had taught her to identify patterns in seemingly random events. These weren't coincidences. Sleep evaded her that night. From her bedroom window, she noticed a vehicle parked at the forest edge, lights off, barely visible in the moonlight. When she checked again, an hour later, it was gone. The sensation of being watched intensified. Over breakfast, Ellie probed gently about the notebook. Jake revealed he'd found it while exploring the cabin's crawl space, looking for a place to create a secret lab, as he called it. The board had been loose, the notebook hidden behind it, along with a rusted key that didn't fit any locks in the cabin. She suggested they prepare properly before returning to the door, positioning it as an archaeological expedition. Jake embraced the idea enthusiastically, creating an equipment list with the methodical thoroughness he'd inherited from Robert. Flashlights with fresh batteries, heavy-duty work gloves, crowbar, portable radio, first aid kit, camera. 3 days later, they returned to the hidden door. Ellie had strategically chosen a Saturday when the trails would be busiest, with hikers providing some security through proximity to others. Shadow stayed close to Jake, his earlier wariness now transformed into protective vigilance. The door looked less ominous in daylight, more like abandoned infrastructure than sinister secret. Jake approached it with the confidence of a young explorer, pointing out details Ellie had missed before faint lettering near the hinges, possibly a serial number or manufacturing mark. Using the crowbar, Ellie applied steady pressure at the door's edge. The metal groaned in protest, decades of corrosion fighting against their intrusion. Jake added his weight, bracing against a nearby tree for leverage. With a sudden crack that echoed through the forest, the seal broke. Stale air rushed outward, carrying the scent of metal and concrete, along with something unidentifiable that made Shadow back away with a low whine. The door swung inward on protesting hinges. Jake aimed his flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow concrete passage extending into darkness. Ellie hesitated at the threshold. Every instinct from her emergency response training screamed caution. Underground structures could contain structural hazards, poor air quality, wildlife that had taken shelter inside. But Jake was already stepping forward, the beam of his flashlight illuminating smooth concrete walls descending at a gentle slope. Ellie caught his shoulder, establishing ground rules before proceeding. Stay together, test the floor before each step, maintain communication with the surface by keeping the door propped open with the crowbar. The passage extended approximately 20 feet before opening into a larger chamber. Ellie's flashlight revealed a space roughly 12 feet square, constructed from poured concrete reinforced with steel. The room was furnished like an office, frozen in time metal desk against the far wall, filing cabinets lining another, and most surprising, banks of electronic equipment that appeared sophisticated despite decades of abandonment. Jake gravitated immediately toward the equipment, his interest in computers and technology drawing him to the mysterious devices. Ellie approached more cautiously, scanning for structural hazards or signs of animal inhabitants. The facility appeared remarkably preserved, protected from weather, and largely untouched by time beyond a layer of dust. The desk surface held scattered papers and manila folders, their contents faded but still legible. Most bore official-looking letterheads and what appeared to be surveillance reports. Phrases like "subject observed at location" and "routine patterns established" jumped out from the pages. Ellie felt a growing unease as she realized these were observation notes on individuals, though the subjects' names had been redacted with black marker. Jake called her attention to the electronic equipment, pointing out power indicators that still glowed faintly. Some system remained operational despite decades of abandonment. The sophisticated technology seemed out of place in this remote mountain location, suggesting resources and authority beyond local capabilities. Ellie picked up a folder that had been placed more deliberately than the scattered papers. Inside, she found a photograph that made her breath catch. 5 men in dark suits stood in front of the county courthouse, their faces serious and official. The image matched the newspaper clipping she'd found in Jake's notebook, but this version was clearer printed on higher quality paper. The same face had been circled in red ink. She recognized 3 men immediately: Frank Cooper Sr., who had been sheriff before his son took over; Dr. Lawrence, who had run the town's medical clinic until his retirement 5 years ago; and William Taylor, who had served as mayor during the 1990s. The circled face belonged to a man that identified in a handwritten note as Agent Wilson, Fed Oversight. The 5th man was labeled County Coroner Evans. Jake had discovered a filing cabinet drawer containing maps of the surrounding area, marked with strange symbols and notations. One map showed their cabin marked with a small red X and what appeared to be observation points noted in the surrounding forest. The violation implicit in those markings sent a chill through Ellie. Someone had been watching their property, documenting movements, treating their home as a subject for surveillance. As Jake explored another cabinet, something caught Ellie's attention: a small red light blinking on what appeared to be a radio transceiver. The equipment wasn't just preserved, some of it was active. Before she could investigate further, the radio unit suddenly crackled to life. A burst of static filled the chamber, followed by a voice so clear it seemed impossible, coming from decades-old equipment. "Unit 7, this is base. Report status." The voice was male, middle-aged, with the clipped efficiency of someone accustomed to authority. Jake froze beside the filing cabinet, eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. Ellie gestured for silence, her heart pounding as they waited to see if the transmission would continue. After a long moment, the radio fell silent. Ellie grabbed Jake's arm, suddenly certain they were in danger. The message was clear: whatever operation this facility had been built to support, it wasn't as dormant as the dusty surfaces suggested. Someone was still monitoring, still expecting reports from Unit 7. Shadow's anxious whining reached them from the entrance, his silhouette visible against the daylight filtering through the open door. The dog had refused to enter the bunker, his instincts keeping him at the threshold like a sentinel. Ellie made a quick decision, gathering the folder with the photograph and as many documents as she could quickly collect. Jake protested leaving so soon, but something in her expression silenced his objections. The active radio, the surveillance maps of their property, the official nature of the documentation all suggested they'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than an abandoned historical site. They exited the bunker rapidly, Ellie securing the door as best she could to make their disturbance less obvious. Shadow pressed against Jake's leg protectively as they made their way back to the main trail. Ellie's mind raced, trying to make sense of what they'd discovered. Government surveillance equipment hidden in a remote mountain bunker, documents showing their property under observation, and most disturbing, communications still active after what appeared to be decades of abandonment. The walk home felt exposed, every rustling branch and bird call suddenly suspect. Ellie caught herself scanning the forest repeatedly, looking for signs of observation or pursuit. Jake seemed less concerned, already theorizing about the bunker's purpose, his imagination filling gaps with scenarios from spy movies and video games. As they approached their cabin, Ellie noticed subtle differences immediately. The front door stood exactly as they'd left it, locked and secure. The windows remained intact, curtains undisturbed, but something was wrong. Shadow sensed it too, his posture shifting from tired hiker to alert guardian, a low growl building in his throat. Ellie told Jake to wait with Shadow while she checked the perimeter. Years of emergency response training had honed her observational skills beyond normal awareness. The dirt beneath the kitchen window showed fresh impressions someone had stood there recently. The back door's frame bore microscopic wood splinters where a tool had been inserted to bypass the lock. Whoever had entered had been professional, careful not to leave obvious signs. Inside, the disturbance was equally subtle. Cushions sat at slightly different angles. Books on shelves had been removed and returned with spines not quite aligned. The kitchen drawers were organized differently, not dramatically, but noticeable to someone who opened them daily. Most concerning, Jake's computer, showed signs of having been accessed. The chair position changed from where he always left it. When Jake joined her inside, his eyes widened at her explanation of the intrusion. This wasn't random vandalism or opportunistic theft. Nothing valuable was missing. Not her grandmother's silver, not the emergency cash she kept in a coffee tin, not the expensive camera equipment Robert had left behind. This had been a search for information. As evening approached, Ellie made a decision that went against her independent nature. They needed to report both the bunker discovery and the break-in. Sheriff Cooper Jr. might dismiss her concerns, but establishing an official record felt necessary. She placed the call from their landline, explaining the situation in measured terms without mentioning the documents they'd taken or the active radio transmission. The sheriff's response was predictably dismissive. The bunker was likely an old civil defense structure, he explained with patronizing patience. Such facilities had been built throughout Appalachia during the Cold War. As for the break-in, he suggested she was being paranoid. Perhaps Jake had moved things around, or Shadow had knocked items over while they were out. Nevertheless, he agreed to send a deputy the following morning, his tone making it clear he considered it a waste of resources. That night, Ellie established new security protocols. Jake would sleep in her room rather than his loft bedroom. Shadow would remain inside rather than taking his usual post on the porch. Doors and windows received additional temporary locks, chair backs wedged under doorknobs, wooden dowels in window tracks. Sleep came fitfully for Ellie. Around 2 in the morning, Shadow's alert posture drew her to the window. A vehicle sat idling at the forest edge, headlights off, only visible by moonlight reflecting off its windshield. As she watched it back slowly down the access road, disappearing among the trees. No coincidence, no misidentification. They were under surveillance. The deputy arrived mid-morning, a young man named Collins, who had graduated from the Regional Police Academy just months earlier. He listened to Ellie's account with barely concealed skepticism, taking minimal notes and showing little interest in examining the subtle evidence of intrusion. His cursory inspection complete, he promised to keep an eye out, while on patrol, a phrase so non-committal it bordered on insulting. After he left, Jake retrieved his notebook, comparing his original findings with the new documents they'd recovered. The connections were becoming clearer. The notebook had belonged to someone involved with Project Clearwater, potentially the circled man in the photograph, Agent Wilson. The cabin's previous owner must have had some connection to him, explaining how the notebook ended up hidden in the crawlspace. Ellie decided their next step should be research. The county library maintained archives of local newspapers and public records that might provide context for the 1993 photograph and the officials identified in it. Jake argued to return to the bunker immediately, but Ellie held firm. Information gathering before action, a principle she'd learned through hard experience as a first responder. Monday morning, Ellie dropped Jake at school despite his protest, promising they would continue their investigation together after properly preparing. At the county library, she introduced herself to Martha Sullivan, the head librarian who had held the position for over 15 years. Martha's efficiency and discretion were legendary in the small community, making her the perfect ally for sensitive research. Ellie explained she was researching local history for a homeschool project with Jake, focusing specifically on law enforcement initiatives from the early 1990s. Martha seemed momentarily hesitant before leading Ellie to the local history section, a collection of bound newspapers, high school yearbooks, and photograph albums documenting the town's evolution. Together, they searched through materials from 1993, finding several references to a federal task force on rural crime prevention that had operated in the area briefly. The newspaper accounts were vague about specific activities, describing community outreach and coordination with local officials, rather than operational details. In a bound volume of the County Herald from October 1993, they found a larger version of the photograph from the bunker. The caption identified all 5 men, including Special Agent Robert Wilson representing the Federal Task Force on Rural Crime Prevention. Martha's expression changed subtly upon seeing the image, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. When pressed, Martha admitted remembering Agent Wilson, a quiet, serious man who had spent several months in their community supposedly coordinating anti-drug initiatives. He had kept to himself, staying at the local inn until completing his assignment. What Martha didn't say, but her expression suggested, was that the memory carried complications she wasn't eager to discuss. Ellie continued her research, finding additional references to the task force and federal grants that had funded expanded surveillance capabilities for rural law enforcement during that period. The more she uncovered, the more legitimate the operation appeared, which only deepened her confusion about the hidden bunker and its sophisticated equipment. As their session concluded, Martha touched Ellie's arm gently, her voice lowered, though no other patrons were nearby. The librarian's warning was oblique but unmistakable. A young reporter from Charleston had come through 5 years ago asking similar questions about federal operations in the 1990s. He had been particularly interested in families who had relocated suddenly during that period. A week after his final visit to the library, his car had gone off Highway 9 in broad daylight. State police ruled he fell asleep at the wheel. The implication hung between them like an unspoken threat. Martha didn't elaborate, but her message was clear. Ellie's research was following a path that had proven dangerous for at least one other person. The librarian provided a manila envelope containing photocopies of everything they'd found, plus additional materials she thought might be relevant to Ellie's project. Walking back to her truck, Ellie felt the weight of the envelope like physical evidence of risk. The bunker's radio equipment, the surveillance documentation of her property, and now Martha's veiled warning suggested something far more sinister than abandoned Cold War infrastructure. As she drove through the mountain roads she'd traveled safely for months, Ellie found herself checking her rearview mirror with increasing frequency. The landscape that had represented security and solitude now felt exposed and threatening, as if hidden eyes tracked her movements from positions she couldn't identify. When she arrived to pick up Jake from school, her son's expression immediately triggered alarm. He was pale, his normally animated face locked in rigid control. Inside the truck, he revealed that Sheriff Cooper Jr. had visited his classroom that morning, ostensibly for a safety presentation, but had afterward pulled Jake aside to ask pointed questions about their weekend activities and whether they'd found anything interesting on their hikes. The timing couldn't be coincidental. They hadn't mentioned the bunker to the deputy who'd responded to their break-in report, yet somehow the sheriff knew to question Jake specifically about discoveries on their property. The surveillance was more immediate and comprehensive than she'd feared. Arriving home, Ellie made a decision that would have seemed paranoid just days earlier. She retrieved her grandfather's old hunting rifle from the locked cabinet and checked it thoroughly, placing it beside the front door. Then she inspected every room, methodically searching for surveillance devices or signs of another intrusion. In the kitchen light fixture, she found a small black disc, no larger than a button, positioned to capture conversations at the table where they typically reviewed Jake's homework and discussed daily plans. The discovery sent ice through her veins. This wasn't random interest or coincidence. They were being actively monitored within their home. Jake's fascination with technology proved useful as he identified the device as a wireless transmitter, likely broadcasting to a receiver within several hundred yards of the cabin. Professional equipment not commercially available, another indication they faced resources beyond ordinary threats. Rather than removing the device, Ellie decided to leave it in place. Alerting their watchers that they discovered the surveillance might trigger more aggressive measures. Better to control the information flowing through known channels than provoke unknown responses. That evening, they staged a careful conversation at the kitchen table, deliberately avoiding mention of the bunker while discussing mundane plans for the week ahead. The performance felt bizarre but necessary, a countermeasure against invisible observers who had invaded their privacy without warning or warrant. After Jake went to bed, Ellie spread Martha's materials across the kitchen table alongside the documents from the bunker. The pattern emerging was troubling in its implications: federal agents working with local officials, unusual activities during 1993, and surveillance operations sophisticated enough to require permanent underground facilities. The most significant discovery came from cross-referencing bunker documents with newspaper archives. 3 families had vanished from local records after October 1993: the Nakamuras, the Reyes, and the Blackwells. Their departures had been explained as relocations for employment or family reasons, but no forwarding addresses remained in county records. Properties had been sold through estate sales, businesses closed without explanation. More disturbing, Ellie found references in the surveillance reports to these families being processed and cleared in the weeks before their disappearances. The clinical terminology suggested something far more sinister than voluntary relocation. As midnight approached, headlights swept across the living room wall, a vehicle turning into their long driveway. Shadow moved to the window, his posture alert but not aggressive. Ellie reached for the rifle, then hesitated, when she recognized the county library's aging delivery van. Martha Sullivan stepped from the vehicle, glancing nervously over her shoulder before approaching the porch. The librarian's unexpected visit at this hour suggested urgency that overrode ordinary caution. Ellie met her at the door, ushering her quickly inside, away from potential observation. Martha's usual composed demeanor had fractured, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a weathered cardboard box on the kitchen table. She explained in hushed tones that after Ellie's visit, she'd remembered additional records stored in the library's basement materials that had been removed from public access years ago on orders from county officials. The box contained personnel files for county employees from 1993-1994, including several who had been terminated without explanation following the federal task force's departure. Most significantly, it held a sealed envelope addressed to future researchers in handwriting that matched notations in Jake's notebook. Martha hadn't opened the envelope out of professional ethics, but her decision to bring these materials to Ellie rather than return them to storage spoke volumes about her assessment of their importance. Before leaving, the librarian extracted a promise that Ellie would never reveal the source of these documents, her fear palpable in the tight lines around her mouth. Alone again, Ellie opened the sealed envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, she found a letter dated September 25, 1993, signed by Robert Wilson, the federal agent whose face had been circled in the photograph. The letter's contents confirmed her worst fears. Wilson described Project Clearwater as an officially sanctioned operation that had evolved from legitimate law enforcement into something monstrous. What had begun as surveillance of suspected drug trafficking had transformed into a program for permanent removal of security risks under the direction of federal handlers whose names had been deliberately omitted. Wilson documented the processing of 3 families who had discovered evidence of illegal surveillance activities. Their relocation had been a cover story. The Nakamura's, Reyes, and Blackwells hadn't moved away. They had been eliminated by federal agents with the cooperation of local officials, including Sheriff Cooper Sr., Dr. Lawrence, and Coroner Evans, all of whom had falsified documents to conceal the deaths. Most chilling was Wilson's admission that he had participated, initially believing the operation fell within national security parameters before realizing the extent of constitutional violations and outright murder being committed under federal authority. His attempts to report these crimes through official channels had been blocked by supervisors who threatened similar processing if he persisted. The letter concluded with Wilson's belief that he would not survive his attempt to expose the program, and indeed Martha's research materials included a brief newspaper item noting Robert Wilson's suicide in October 1993, just weeks after the photographed meeting. The official report cited depression and work stress. Ellie sat motionless at the table, the implications of Wilson's letter expanding through her consciousness like ice fracturing. What they discovered wasn't just historical wrongdoing. It was evidence of murder, sanctioned by federal authority and concealed by local officials, some of whom still held positions of power in the community. Sheriff Cooper Jr. had followed his father into law enforcement. Dr. Lawrence still lived in town, though retired. The current coroner had trained under Evans. The institutional knowledge necessary to continue concealing these crimes remained intact nearly 30 years later. More immediately threatening was the active surveillance of her property and home. If the same people responsible for processing 3 families in 1993 now knew Ellie and Jake had discovered evidence of their crimes, mother and son faced immediate danger beyond ordinary threats. Through the kitchen window, movement caught her eye, a figure at the forest edge, briefly illuminated by moonlight, before disappearing into shadow. Not her imagination, not paranoia. Someone was watching the cabin, monitoring their activities in real time. The sound of Jake's bedroom door opening upstairs pulled her attention away from the window. Her son stood on the landing, sleep-tousled, but alert, shadow beside him. The dog's posture conveyed protective alertness rather than alarm, suggesting the animal recognized whoever lurked outside. Jake descended the stairs slowly, his expression serious beyond his years. From behind his back, he produced a folded paper Ellie hadn't seen before. A note he'd found taped to his locker at school after the sheriff's visit. The handwriting matched Wilson's letter, though obviously from a different author. The message was simple but chilling. "They're watching you because of what your father found. The cabin isn't safe. Trust no one in uniform." The reference to Jake's father sent electricity through Ellie's nervous system. Robert Morgan's death 3 years ago had been ruled an accident, a fall, while hiking familiar terrain that no experienced outdoorsman should have found challenging. She'd questioned the circumstances privately, but lacked evidence to support her doubts. Now connections crystallized with terrible clarity. Robert's environmental consulting work had brought them to this region initially. His sudden decision to purchase the remote cabin had seemed impulsive at the time and a desire to raise Jake away from urban pressures. What if he had discovered evidence of Project Clearwater during his environmental surveys? What if his death had been another processing disguised as accident? The radio in the bunker crackled again in memory. Unit 7 report status. Someone was still monitoring, still expecting reports, still potentially eliminating threats to their operation. The surveillance of Ellie's cabins at break-in, sheriff's questioning of Jake all indicated active response to perceived security risks. The same response that had preceded the disappearance of 3 families in 1993. Jake's face showed a terrible understanding beyond his 12 years. He'd made the same connections, drawn the same conclusions. His father's death, their cabin purchased the hidden notebook, surveillance, all pieces of a pattern that threatened their safety in immediate physical ways. Outside branches cracked under deliberate footsteps approaching the cabin. Shadow's posture shifted, hackles rising as he positioned himself between Jake and the front door. The dog's reaction wasn't aggression toward a stranger, but recognition of someone familiar, now perceived as threat. Through the window, Ellie glimpsed a figure approaching slowly across the yard, moonlight revealing the distinctive uniform of the county sheriff's department. Not Cooper himself, but Deputy Collins, returning well outside normal patrol, hours without vehicle or radio announcement. His hand rested casually on his service weapon as he mounted the porch steps, expression hidden in shadow. The casual confidence in his movement suggested he expected no resistance, no complications. Just another routine task in service to whatever Project Clearwater had evolved into over 3 decades of operation. Ellie pulled Jake away from the window, mind racing through limited options. Running meant exposure on open ground. Staying meant confrontation with unknown odds. The deputy's arrival without backup suggested confidence rather than caution. He wasn't expecting resistance from a single mother and child. That assumption might provide their only advantage. Robert had taught Ellie more than love for these mountains. Her late husband's military background had included tactical training he'd shared during their marriage lessons she'd absorbed without understanding their potential importance. As Collins knocked at the door, voice calling out with professional courtesy that masked his midnight arrival, Ellie made her decision. They would not become the next family processed by whatever remnants of Project Clearwater still operated in these mountains. Whatever her husband had discovered, whatever Agent Wilson had tried to expose, whatever truth lay hidden in that bunker, it would not remain buried at the cost of her son's life. The deputy knocked again, harder this time, authority replacing courtesy. Shadow growled low in his throat, a sound Ellie had heard only once before when a wildfire had trapped them on a ridge during a training exercise. The sound of ultimate warning before action. Ellie positioned Jake behind her, away from direct line of sight from windows or doorways. The weight of understanding passed between them without words. Trust, determination, and the fierce protectiveness that had defined their relationship since Robert's death. As Collins tried the doorknob, finding it locked, Ellie tightened her grip on the hunting rifle. The deputy would enter, expecting compliance based on authority. What he would find instead was a mother prepared to protect her child against threats, both official and hidden, regardless of the uniform they wore or the authority they claimed. The door hinges creaked as pressure applied from outside tested their strength. Shadows growled, deepened muscles tensing in preparation. Ellie raised the rifle to ready position, her firefighter's training providing steadiness under pressure. The true nature of Project Clearwater, the fate of the vanished families, the connection to Robert's death, all remain questions without complete answers. But one certainty crystallized in Ellie's mind. As the door began to give way under renewed pressure, whatever secrets lay buried in these mountains would not claim her family as their next victims. The door exploded inward with splintering force, Shadow lunging forward as Deputy Collins stumbled through the threshold. The deputy's hand moved toward his weapon but froze midway when confronted with Ellie's steady aim. Their standoff lasted only seconds before recognition shifted his expression from professional authority to something more complicated. Collins raised his hands slowly, palms forward. In the cold silence, his unexpected words shattered Ellie's assumptions. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm not here to hurt you. I knew your husband. He saved my life." Shadow maintained his defensive stance, but didn't attack his canine instincts, detecting something Ellie's adrenaline-flooded brain couldn't process immediately. The deputy's eyes reflected genuine fear not of her weapon, but of something outside beyond the broken doorframe. Colin's revelation about Robert struck Ellie like physical impact. Before she could respond, headlights swept across the windows, multiple vehicles approaching along their access road. The deputy's expression confirmed her worst fears. They weren't alone, and whoever followed him wasn't coming to help. Collins moved with urgent precision, securing the damaged door as best he could while Ellie maintained her defensive position. He'd come to warn them, not threaten, a distinction that meant little now that others approached. His whispered explanation tumbled out between actions. Robert Morgan had discovered environmental testing reports showing radiation anomalies in local watersheds, documents linked to Project Clearwater. Collins had been a rookie park ranger, then assigned to escort the environmental consultant. They'd found more than contaminated soil samples. Jake emerged from his position behind the kitchen doorway, Shadow moving to his side instinctively. The boy's face showed the calculating focus that reminded Ellie painfully of Robert, absorbing information, assessing threats, formulating plans. At 12, he shouldn't have needed these skills, yet here they were. Collins outlined their limited options with brutal efficiency. Sheriff Cooper would arrive with at least 2 deputies. Standard procedure would separate mother from son for questioning, a tactic that had preceded the disappearances of 3 families 30 years earlier. Once separated, neither would likely be seen again. The cabin's remote location, once a sanctuary, now represented a tactical disadvantage. No neighbors to witness unusual activities. No passing traffic to interrupt official actions. Perfect isolation for another family to be processed under color of authority. Ellie made her decision in the compressed seconds between understanding and action. They wouldn't separate her from Jake. They wouldn't disappear like the others. Whatever Robert had discovered, whatever Agent Wilson had documented, would not remain buried along with her family. Collins guided them through the back door as vehicle engines rumbled to a stop at the front of the cabin. Shadow moved silently ahead, his dark coat invisible in the night forest. Jake followed, carrying only his backpack containing the notebook and documents they'd collected, physical evidence of crimes spanning 3 decades. Ellie hesitated at the threshold, years of responsible citizenship warring against mounting evidence of institutional corruption. Running from law enforcement contradicted everything she'd taught Jake about trust and authority. Yet the documented fate of the Nakamura Reyes and Blackwell families left no alternative. Official badges had provided cover for their executions. They would not serve the same purpose again. The forest enveloped them in protective darkness, Collins leading them along game trails invisible to untrained eyes. His knowledge of the terrain suggested preparations made long before tonight's crisis, contingency planning for exactly this scenario. Behind them, shouts and flashlight beams cut through the trees as the sheriff's team discovered their absence. Radio crackle carried across the stillness, coordinates being relayed to additional units. The search pattern expanded with practiced efficiency, suggesting this wasn't the first time such a pursuit had been organized. Collins pushed them to move faster, staying off established paths where searchers would concentrate efforts. The deputy's familiarity with both police procedures and escape routes painted a complicated picture of a man living within a corrupt system while preparing to oppose it. Jake stumbled over exposed roots, exhaustion and fear, finally overcoming adolescent resilience. Ellie lifted him, despite his protest, her firefighter's strength carrying them forward when his legs faltered. Shadow ranged ahead, occasionally returning to check their progress, his training as a search and rescue companion repurposed for evasion. As dawn approached, Collins directed them toward a structure barely visible through the trees, an abandoned hunting cabin tucked into a rocky outcropping. Unlike the polished tourist cabins that dotted more accessible areas, this weathered shelter predated modern building codes and appeared on no rental registries or tax records. Inside, Collins revealed supplies cached for emergency use: water, non-perishable food, basic medical equipment. The preparations suggested long-term planning rather than spontaneous assistance. The deputy had been waiting for something to trigger this exact scenario. While Jake collapsed into exhausted sleep, Shadow maintaining protective watch beside him, Collins explained his connection to Robert Morgan and the events that had led to their current crisis. He'd been present 3 years ago when Robert had discovered unusual equipment during routine environmental sampling. Surveillance devices installed under federal authority but operating decades beyond their authorized mission. Robert had documented everything, gathering evidence for federal oversight committees, believing naively that exposing illegal operations would trigger official investigation. Instead, his activities had been detected through the very surveillance network he was documenting. His hiking accident had been neither accidental nor unpredictable. Collins had received similar threats when he questioned the investigation's findings. His choice then, apparent compliance while secretly preserving Robert's evidence, had kept him alive but compromised. For 3 years, he'd maintained his cover within the sheriff's department, watching for opportunities to expose the truth without sacrificing himself in the process. The arrival of Ellie and Jake at Robert's cabin had triggered increased surveillance. Their discovery of the bunker had accelerated timeline contingencies that Collins had hoped would never activate. Now they were running not just from local authorities, but from federal operations designed specifically to eliminate security threats with minimal documentation or oversight. As morning light filtered through the cabin's dirty windows, Collins assessed their limited options. The sheriff would have alerted state police by now, distributing descriptions and fabricating charges to justify an intensive search. Standard procedure would include roadblocks on major highways and monitoring of transportation hubs. Their disappearance would be framed as parental kidnapping or criminal flight, providing legal cover for extraordinary measures. Jake woke as they discussed next steps, his young face showing the premature aging that comes from sudden trauma. The resilient child, who had already weathered his father's death, now faced the knowledge that nothing in his life had been coincidental. Not their move to the mountains, not their cabin's location, not even his father's professional interests. Everything connected to a conspiracy that had already claimed multiple lives and now threatened their own. The immediate problem was information asymmetry. Their pursuers knew these mountains controlled communications networks and operated with official authority. Ellie, Jake, and Collins possessed evidence, but lacked secure channels to transmit it beyond local interference. Jake's technical knowledge proved unexpectedly valuable. His examination of the hunting cabin revealed what adults had overlooked: ancient telephone wiring still connected to junction boxes that predated wireless communications. Though modern service had been disconnected years earlier, the physical infrastructure remained intact. With components from his emergency kit, Jake believed he could establish limited connectivity, enough to transmit digital images of key documents to outside authorities. While Jake worked on the technical challenge, Collins outlined their next target: finding Daniel Nakamura. The name registered immediately from the documents they discovered. Daniel was the brother of Paul Nakamura, one of the family members who had supposedly relocated in 1993. According to Collins, Daniel hadn't disappeared with his brother's family, but had remained in the area under suspicious circumstances, occasionally observed near Project Clearwater locations, but never directly interfaced with by law enforcement. If Daniel had survived for 30 years with knowledge of the project, he might possess information critical to understanding its current operations. More importantly, he might know communication channels not monitored by local authorities. Their planning session ended abruptly at the sound of a helicopter passing overhead, not the rhythmic thud of medical transport, but the sharper beat of law enforcement aerial surveillance. The search had escalated beyond local resources, suggesting state or federal involvement. Their window for unrestricted movement was closing rapidly. Jake completed his improvised communication attempt, but reported failure. The lines had been physically cut at some point since the cabin's abandonment. The isolation that had initially appeared to offer protection now reinforced their vulnerability. Without external communication, they couldn't transmit evidence or request intervention from authorities beyond local control. Collins proposed a high-risk alternative: return to the bunker they discovered. If Project Clearwater's communication equipment remained operational, it might offer both information about current operations and potential access to external networks not controlled by the sheriff's department. The risk calculation was brutal in its simplicity. Remaining in place ensured eventual discovery. Attempting to flee the region meant exposure to roadblocks and identification systems. Returning to the bunker represented their best chance to understand what they faced and potentially communicate with outside authorities, despite the obvious danger of approaching a location their pursuers would certainly monitor. As they prepared to move, Collins shared intelligence about search patterns and shift rotations, knowledge that might provide a narrow window of opportunity. The helicopter crew would require refueling after approximately 3 hours. Deputy shift changes occurred at predictable intervals. These operational necessities created potential blind spots in the search coverage. They departed the hunting cabin near midday, taking advantage of the search's focus on major roads and trails. Collins led them through dense underbrush, avoiding open areas where aerial observation might detect movement. Shadow ranged ahead, his hunting instincts repurposed for evasion rather than pursuit. Jake maintained remarkable composure for his age, following instructions precisely and moving with disciplined silence. The boy who had struggled with his father's death now channeled that unresolved grief into focused determination. Ellie recognized Robert's influence in her son's methodical response to crisis, assessing, planning, executing without emotional distraction. As they approached the hillside containing the hidden bunker, Collins implemented counter-surveillance techniques he'd learned through professional training: irregular movement patterns, periodic stops to listen for pursuers, careful attention to disturbed vegetation that might indicate recent passage. The procedures felt foreign to Ellie's experience, but reflected the reality they now inhabited, hunted by authorities equipped with both legal power and extra-legal intentions. The bunker's entrance remained as they had left it, partially concealed by natural growth, but accessible to those who knew its location. Collins examined the surroundings for signs of recent activity before approaching the door directly. No fresh footprints marked the earth, no broken branches suggested hurried entry. Either their pursuers hadn't identified this specific location, or they monitored it remotely without physical presence. Inside, the concrete chamber remained unchanged. Electronic equipment humming with minimal power filing cabinets partially open as they had left them. Collins moved immediately to the radio equipment, examining connections and power indicators with professional familiarity. His assessment confirmed what they had suspected. The system remained operational and connected to a broader network, though its exact parameters weren't immediately obvious. Jake gravitated toward the surveillance equipment, his technical curiosity temporarily overriding his function. His examination revealed sophisticated technology that seemed incongruous with the bunker's apparent age, components that appeared to have been upgraded periodically despite the facility's abandoned appearance. While Collins attempted to understand the communication system and Jake explored the surveillance equipment, Ellie returned to the filing cabinets, searching for additional documentation about Daniel Nakamura. If he had remained in the area after his brother's family disappeared, official records might indicate his location or movements. The personnel files contained unexpected information. Daniel Nakamura had been employed by the Forest Service until 1993, when he was abruptly terminated without explanation. Subsequent documents indicated periodic surveillance of his movements for years afterward, though the reports became increasingly sporadic after 2000. The last entry, dated just 6 months earlier, noted his residence at a remote property outside normal patrol routes, with the concerning addition: terminal condition confirmed. Monitoring reduced to weekly status checks. Ellie shared this information with Collins, whose expression confirmed the implications. Daniel Nakamura was dying. His declining health apparently deemed sufficient security containment to reduce active surveillance. This potentially explained why he had survived 3 decades with knowledge that had proven fatal to others. Perhaps his silence had been secured through threats to remaining family members, or perhaps he possessed leverage that made his elimination too risky. Their planning session ended abruptly as the radio equipment activated unexpectedly. A burst of static, followed by a coded transmission that Collins recognized immediately from his work with the Sheriff's Department. He translated with growing alarm. All units were being redirected to Sector 7 coordinates matching their current location. Someone had detected their presence at the bunker. The transmission confirmed their worst fears about surveillance capabilities. Despite careful approach and no visible monitoring devices, their presence had triggered some alert system integrated into the bunker itself. Their discovery wasn't coincidental. The facility had been designed to detect and report unauthorized access. Collins urged immediate evacuation, but Jake's attention remained fixed on the surveillance equipment he'd been examining. His urgent gestures drew them to a monitor displaying thermal imaging of the surrounding forest, multiple heat signatures converging on their location from different directions. The search teams had established a perimeter and were methodically tightening it around the bunker entrance. Escape through the main door would lead directly into their pursuers' approach vectors. Collins searched the chamber frantically for alternative exits, focusing on ventilation systems or maintenance access that might provide escape routes. His examination revealed a small access panel near the floor partially concealed behind filing cabinets, likely an emergency exit or maintenance tunnel connecting to other facilities. The panel resisted initial attempts to open it, decades of disuse having sealed connections and corroded hinges. While Collins worked to create an escape route, Ellie gathered critical documents they'd discovered, focusing on evidence that connected current officials to historical crimes. Jake downloaded digital information from accessible systems using techniques he'd developed through his interest in computer security, skills Ellie had previously considered merely recreational, now proving crucial to their survival. Shadow's low growl warned of approaching danger seconds before they heard movement outside the main entrance. Collins finally breached the access panel, revealing a narrow tunnel barely large enough for an adult to navigate while crawling. The confined space triggered Ellie's professional concern about structural integrity and air quality, but immediate threats outweighed potential hazards. Jake entered first, Shadow following with reluctant compliance. The dog's instinctive caution about confined spaces temporarily overridden by training and trust. Ellie followed, documents secured inside her jacket. Collins came last, pulling the access panel closed behind them and using his pocket knife to jam the locking mechanism, a temporary barrier that might buy critical minutes. The tunnel extended horizontally for approximately 50 feet before angling upward. Decades of neglect had left sections partially collapsed, requiring careful navigation around fallen concrete and exposed rebar. The confined space amplified every sound, their breathing movement against the tunnel walls, distant voices from the chamber they'd evacuated. They emerged through a concealed exit camouflaged among rock formations several hundred yards from the main bunker entrance. The exit's design suggested intentional emergency planning, positioned to provide evacuation options while remaining invisible to casual observation. Collins oriented them immediately, identifying their position relative to known search patterns and proposing a route toward Daniel Nakamura's last known location. As they moved away from the bunker site, helicopter sounds returned, rhythmic beats cutting through forest canopy as aerial search resumed. Collins estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes before their escape would be discovered and pursuit redirected. Their immediate objective was maximum distance in minimum time, sacrificing stealth for speed while remaining under tree cover to avoid aerial detection. The mountain terrain that had previously represented Ellie's sanctuary now presented tactical challenges. Steep inclines that slowed progress, exposed ridgelines that required careful navigation to avoid skyline silhouettes visible from distance, stream crossings that left trackable evidence for trained pursuers. Jake maintained remarkable endurance despite his age, driven by adrenaline and survival instinct. Shadow ranged ahead, identifying optimal paths through difficult terrain with instinctive efficiency. Collins periodically consulted his satellite GPS unit, confirming their bearing toward Daniel Nakamura's property while monitoring their pursuers' communications through his department radio. The radio transmissions painted an alarming picture of escalating response. Sheriff Cooper had requested additional resources from neighboring counties. State police had been advised of armed and dangerous subjects in the National Forest area. Roadblocks were being established on all major exit routes. The fictional narrative transforming a mother and son into dangerous fugitives was being constructed in real time through official channels. By late afternoon, fatigue began affecting their progress. Jake stumbled more frequently, exhaustion undermining even youthful resilience. Shadow showed signs of paw damage from rough terrain. Collins maintained better condition through professional training, but acknowledged they couldn't continue at their current pace indefinitely. The densely forested valley they traversed suddenly opened onto a small clearing containing a modest cabin, weathered wooden construction with a metal roof, solar panels visible on the southern exposure, a small greenhouse attached to the eastern wall. No vehicles were visible, no power lines connected to external grids, no satellite dishes suggested communication capabilities. Collins signaled for caution as they approached, unsure of the occupants' awareness or potential reaction to unexpected visitors. Shadow moved ahead, scenting the air with professional focus before returning with relaxed body language, no indication of immediate threat detected. The cabin door opened before they reached it, revealing an elderly Asian man supporting himself with a carved wooden cane. Despite apparent physical frailty, his posture suggested alertness, and his gaze conveyed immediate assessment of their condition and numbers. Daniel Nakamura had been expecting someone, though perhaps not this specific group. Inside the cabin, Nakamura moved with the deliberate pace of someone conserving limited energy. Cancer had reduced his physical capabilities, but left his mental acuity intact. He recognized Collins immediately, not from personal interaction, but from surveillance photographs he'd acquired through methods he declined to specify. His knowledge of their situation suggested information sources beyond normal civilian access. Nakamura confirmed their suspicions about Project Clearwater's evolution from legitimate federal operation to extra-legal assassination program. His brother Paul had discovered financial discrepancies in Forest Service contracts awarded to private security firms, transfers that concealed funding for surveillance equipment deployed throughout the region. Paul's inquiries had triggered response protocols designed to eliminate security risks, resulting in the murder of his family disguised as voluntary relocation. Daniel's survival had been negotiated through terrible compromise. His silence purchased with threats against remaining family members living on the West Coast. For 30 years, he'd maintained a careful balance between compliance and resistance, gathering evidence, while presenting no obvious threat to operational security. His terminal cancer diagnosis had altered this calculation, removing the primary leverage used to ensure his cooperation. The files Nakamura had accumulated over 3 decades occupied a hidden room beneath the cabin's main floor, accessed through a trapdoor concealed under an area rug. The underground chamber contained filing cabinets, organized chronologically, detailing Project Clearwater's transformation from temporary federal task force to permanent extra-legal operation funded through classified budgets and criminal enterprises. Most disturbing were personnel records documenting the program's generational continuity. Sheriff Cooper Jr. wasn't merely his father's successor, he was a federal agent specifically placed to maintain operational security in the region. Other local officials had been similarly recruited or compromised, creating institutional protection for activities that violated constitutional protections and federal laws. Nakamura's most valuable intelligence concerned current operations. Project Clearwater had evolved beyond its original surveillance mission into a training ground for federal elimination of American citizens deemed security risks. The remote location, compliant local authorities, and established infrastructure made the region ideal for practical field exercises in techniques that could not be officially documented or acknowledged. The documents confirmed Robert Morgan's fatal discovery 3 years earlier. Environmental testing had revealed radiation signatures from materials that used in federal operations, potentially endangering local watersheds. His attempt to report these findings through official channels had triggered security protocols established decades earlier, resulting in his staged hiking accident. While Ellie processed these revelations about her husband's death, Jake focused on immediate tactical problems. The cabin's isolation provided temporary security but offered no long-term solution. Nakamura confirmed their communications concerns. All regional networks were monitored, all transportation hubs observed all digital traffic filtered through systems designed to identify specific content signatures. Their evidence, documents from the bunker, Martha Sullivan's archived materials, Nakamura's collected files, meant nothing without secure transmission to authorities beyond local interference. Federal oversight committees, congressional investigators, legitimate FBI operations, all existed beyond the corrupted system controlling this region, but remained inaccessible through conventional communication channels. Nakamura revealed his contingency plan developed over decades of careful preparation. An independent communication system using frequencies outside normal monitoring parameters connected to international monitoring stations rather than domestic networks. The equipment looked deceptively simple, components assembled from commercially available parts that would attract no attention individually, but function collectively as a sophisticated transmission system. The technology exploited a vulnerability in Project Clearwater's security architecture. While domestic communications were comprehensively monitored, international frequencies received less attention based on outdated Cold War protocols. Nakamura had identified this gap through his brother's original research, preserving the knowledge through 30 years of surveillance and intimidation. Preparations for transmission required careful coordination. Jake's technical knowledge proved essential in configuring equipment for maximum data transmission within limited bandwidth. Collins organized evidence chronologically, prioritizing documentation that connected current officials to historical crimes. Ellie categorized medical records showing falsified causes of death for the three families eliminated in 1993. Shadow's sudden alertness interrupted their work. Ears forward, body tensed toward the cabin's western approach. Collins moved immediately to the window, confirming their fears through observation of disturbed vegetation along the forest edge. Their pursuers had tracked them despite careful evasion techniques, perhaps through technology they didn't understand or informants they hadn't identified. Nakamura accelerated their timeline, abandoning comprehensive transmission for essential documentation. The communication system required approximately 3 minutes to establish connection with international monitoring stations, followed by data transmission time proportional to file size. Their priorities shifted from complete evidence to critical documentation that would trigger inevitable investigation once received by appropriate authorities. The approaching search team's radio communications monitored through Collins's department equipment confirmed comprehensive deployment, multiple units converging on their location from different directions, aerial support providing thermal imaging for personnel hiding under forest canopy. Most concerning was the voice directing operations. Alexandra Rivera, identified through Nakamura's files as the federal agent who had coordinated the 1993 eliminations and maintained operational continuity through subsequent decades. Collins volunteered to create diversion using his knowledge of search protocols to draw pursuers away from the cabin temporarily. His departure through the eastern approach coincided with Shadow's increasing agitation toward the western perimeter. The dog's behavior suggested multiple approaching threats from different directions, a standard encirclement tactic for high-priority targets. Nakamura initiated transmission sequences, while Ellie and Jake continued preparing critical documentation. The equipment hummed with increasing power as connection protocols activated, searching for responsive frequencies among international monitoring stations. Progress indicators showed successful handshake procedures with unidentified receivers, confirming Nakamura's theory about security architecture vulnerabilities. The first data package transmitted successfully, medical examiner records showing bullet wounds inconsistent with reported accidents, toxicology results documenting substances not included in official reports, photographic evidence contradicting stated causes of death. The transmission indicators confirmed receipt acknowledgement from international monitoring stations, placing the evidence beyond local interference capabilities. Their success proved short-lived as the cabin's perimeter sensors triggered proximity alerts. Multiple heat signatures approached from western and northern vectors, maintaining professional spacing and communication discipline. The search team had located them more quickly than anticipated, suggesting tracking capabilities beyond conventional methods. Nakamura urged Ellie and Jake toward the cabin's rear exit while continuing transmission procedures. His intention became clear through actions rather than words. He would remain behind, ensuring complete transmission while providing time for their escape. His terminal condition made his choice simultaneously noble and practical. His remaining lifespan measured in months, regardless of current circumstances, his utility maximized through securing evidence transmission rather than attempted escape. Ellie resisted initially, unwilling to abandon someone who had risked everything to help them. Nakamura's response cut through emotional objections with logical precision. Jake's safety represented the only meaningful outcome now. Everything else, evidence, justice, even survival for adults involved, meant nothing compared to protecting her son from becoming another statistic in Project Clearwater's operational history. The approaching team breached the forest perimeter as Ellie and Jake exited through the rear door, Shadow leading them toward concealment among dense rhododendron thickets. The transmission equipment continued operating inside progress indicators, showing successful data packages reaching international receivers, while Nakamura prepared for inevitable confrontation. From their concealed position, they observed the cabin's encirclement, tactical team members in unmarked dark clothing rather than official uniforms, communication equipment suggesting federal resources rather than local law enforcement. The operations leader emerged from protective formation, a woman in her 50s whose authoritative posture confirmed operational command without requiring insignia or identification. Alexandra Rivera approached the cabin directly while subordinates maintained perimeter security. Her confidence suggested certainty about the occupant's identity and limited threat capability. No demands for surrender, no negotiation attempts. Just direct approach toward a subject deemed incapable of effective resistance. Inside, Nakamura continued transmission procedures prioritizing final data packages containing current operational details, personnel assignments, funding mechanisms, scheduled elimination activities. The evidence transmission reached completion seconds before Rivera entered the cabin, placing critical documentation beyond local control, regardless of subsequent events. What happened inside remained invisible from their observation position, but radio communications monitored through equipment Nakamura had provided revealed operational commands, secure transmission equipment for analysis, implement clean site protocols, establish expanded search perimeter for additional subjects. The clinical terminology masked violent realities. Daniel Nakamura would not leave the cabin alive, and clean site protocols would remove evidence of his existence as thoroughly as his brother's family had been erased 30 years earlier. The search perimeter expanded outward from the cabin as Rivera directed resources toward locating remaining fugitives. Ellie, Jake, and Shadow remained concealed within dense vegetation. Shadow's dark coat and their absolute stillness preventing detection by searchers passing within yards of their position. The professional discipline of the tactical team proved both impressive and terrifying. Systematic coverage of terrain infrared equipment scanning undergrowth communications maintained through hand signals rather than potentially detectable radio transmissions. Night approached with agonizing slowness, each minute extending their vulnerability, while searchers maintained position around Nakamura's property. The tactical team established generator-powered lighting around the cabin, creating artificial daylight for continued operations. Transport vehicles arrived, removing equipment, and undoubtedly Nakamura's remains, though specific activities remained obscured from their observation position. Rivera coordinated operations from a mobile command post established near the cabin's front approach. Her occasional movement into visible areas revealed professional focus rather than emotional involvement. This wasn't personal vendetta, but routine operational security implementation. The clinical detachment somehow made her more terrifying than theatrical malevolence would have been. Eliminating security risks represented administrative function rather than personal motivation. Radio communications intercepted through Nakamura's equipment revealed operational planning for expanded search protocols beginning at dawn. Additional personnel deployment canine units specializing in human tracking drone surveillance for areas inaccessible to ground teams. Their temporary concealment would become inadequate against resources being mobilized for comprehensive search operations. As full darkness finally provided concealment beyond thermal detection ranges, Ellie assessed their desperate situation. Nakamura's sacrifice had secured evidence transmission, but left them without guidance or resources in terrain crawling with professional hunters. Collins had not returned from his diversion attempt, suggesting either capture or worse. They possessed Nakamura's emergency supplies, water purification tablets, high-calorie ration bars, basic first aid materials, but nothing approaching requirements for extended evasion. Most critically, they lacked secure communication channels to determine whether Nakamura's transmission had actually reached appropriate authorities. International monitoring stations might have received the data packages, but bureaucratic processes could delay appropriate response for days or weeks, time they simply didn't have against the resources arrayed against them. Jake's unexpected suggestion emerged through whispered assessment of their limited options. Nakamura's files had included reference to a secondary facility, designated Site B in Project Clearwater documentation, located approximately 7 miles northeast of their current position. While returning to known project locations seemed counterintuitive, Jake reasoned that pursuers would expect them to flee away from rather than toward operational facilities. Additionally, such sites might contain communication equipment capable of monitoring response to Nakamura's transmission. Their decision made through desperate calculation rather than confidence. They began careful movement through darkness, Shadow ranging ahead to detect potential ambush positions. The dog's training and search operations provided invaluable counterpoint to their pursuers' technological advantages. Natural senses detecting human presence through scent and sound beyond electronic detection capabilities. Ellie maintained physical contact with Jake through difficult terrain, her son's exhaustion becoming increasingly evident despite remarkable endurance for his age. The psychological weight of everything they'd learned, his father's murder disguised as accident, federal programs eliminating American citizens without oversight or accountability, local authorities compromised beyond redemption, compounded physical fatigue from extended evasion through challenging mountain terrain. Near midnight, Shadow's behavior changed abruptly. Not the alert tension indicating threat detection, but recognition signals suggesting familiar presence. From dense undergrowth ahead, Collins emerged with night vision equipment and obvious physical injuries. His diversion had partially succeeded in drawing pursuit resources away temporarily, though at significant personal cost. Left arm hanging awkwardly from damaged shoulder facial lacerations, suggesting close-quarter confrontation rather than environmental injury. Collins confirmed their worst fears about operational escalation. Rivera had received authorization for terminal protocol implementation, comprehensive security measures including elimination of anyone potentially exposed to Project Clearwater information. This included not just Ellie and Jake, but Martha Sullivan at the county library, Deputy Collins himself, and approximately 20 additional county residents whose routine activities or historical knowledge represented potential security vulnerabilities. The terminal protocol explained increased resources deployed to the region. This wasn't merely pursuit of specific fugitives, but comprehensive elimination of an entire knowledge network. Previous implementations had been disguised as natural disasters, industrial accidents, or isolated criminal activities. The operational scale suggested imminent action rather than extended planning. Events triggered by their discovery of the bunker had accelerated timeline contingencies previously held in reserve. Their discussion ended abruptly at Shadow's alert posture, ears forward, body tense toward eastern approach vectors. Collins interpreted the dog's signals through professional experience, identifying likely tactical team movement patterns based on minimal available indicators. Their position had been compromised, their temporary advantage eliminated through methodical search expansion. As they prepared for immediate relocation, distant radio transmissions captured through Collins's gear equipment revealed unexpected complications. References to external oversight activation and congressional notification protocols suggested Nakamura's transmission had reached appropriate authorities and triggered response mechanisms beyond Project Clearwater's control abilities. Rivera's voice cut through procedural terminology with unmistakable urgency. Accelerate terminal protocol. Implementation. Prioritize elimination of primary knowledge repositories. Establish operational deniability through environmental causation narratives. Translated from bureaucratic obscurity, the orders were chillingly clear. Kill everyone who might know anything, blame natural disasters or accidents, eliminate evidence before external authorities could intervene. The tactical situation transformed through this intelligence. They weren't simply evading capture, but racing against implementation of mass elimination protocols designed to conceal decades of crimes before legitimate oversight could intervene. Their survival meant nothing compared to warning potential victims about imminent threat. Martha Sullivan community members identified in Nakamura's files anyone whose routine activities or historical knowledge had placed them on Project Clearwater's terminal protocol target list. Collins outlined their limited options with professional assessment. Rivera's operational control included roadblocks on all major transportation routes, surveillance of communication networks, and tactical teams deployed throughout the region. Conventional approaches to warning potential victims would fail against these comprehensive security measures. Jake proposed solution through technical knowledge that initially seemed tangential. The emergency broadcast system maintained for weather and disaster notifications operated on protected frequencies with override capabilities designed specifically for critical public safety announcements. Access required physical presence at transmission facilities with appropriate authorization codes, but could theoretically bypass normal communications security measures. Collins confirmed regional broadcast infrastructure included transmission equipment at fire observation towers maintained by Forest Service, facilities designed to function during emergencies when normal communication channels might be compromised. One such tower existed approximately 4 miles northeast of their current position, potentially offering both communication capabilities and elevated observation advantages. Their decision formed through desperate calculation rather than confidence. Proceed toward the fire observation tower attempt. Emergency broadcast system access. Warn potential victims about imminent threat while simultaneously alerting legitimate federal authorities to ongoing criminal activities. The plan contained countless vulnerabilities, but offered their only potential path toward preventing mass casualties through terminal protocol implementation. Shadow alerted to approaching search teams seconds before they began movement toward their new objective. The dog's behavior suggested multiple threat vectors converging on their position, professional trackers following indicators that Ellie and Jake would have considered invisible. Collins implemented counter-tracking techniques as they moved, irregular path selection, watercourse navigation to eliminate scent trails, careful attention to avoid physical evidence that might indicate direction or number. The night forest that had previously represented sanctuary now felt exposed and threatening, every shadow potentially concealing observers, every sound possibly indicating pursuit. Jake maintained remarkable discipline despite physical exhaustion and emotional trauma moving as directed, and maintaining silence even when difficult terrain caused minor injuries. Ellie recognized her son's transformation from child to survivor, a necessary evolution under current circumstances, but one that fractured her heart nonetheless. As they approached the fire observation tower's access road shortly before dawn, Collins intercepted radio communications indicating search concentrations shifting toward their actual location. Tracker teams had identified their direction. Despite countermeasures, drone deployments were being redirected to probable approach vectors, and Rivera herself had relocated command operations to forward positions near the tower facility. Their tenuous advantage had evaporated, their desperate plan compromised before implementation. Collins adjusted tactical assessment accordingly. They couldn't reach the tower undetected through conventional approach. Alternative access would require distraction resources they didn't possess, or diversionary tactics likely to fail against professional security teams. Jake's unexpected silence during tactical discussion reflected neither fear nor resignation, but intense concentration on the notebook he'd carried since discovering it in their cabin. His examination revealed details previously overlooked. Schematics for Project Clearwater facilities, including infrastructure connections between operational sites. The fire observation tower's electrical and communication systems connected to underground infrastructure, accessible through maintenance tunnels, documented in the facility plans, but likely unknown to Rivera's tactical teams. Collins confirmed feasibility through his knowledge of Forest Service infrastructure. Emergency access systems designed for firefighter safety during wildfire events included underground routes between critical facilities. Such access points would be secured but potentially navigable with appropriate approach vectors and technical knowledge. Their revised plan formed through collaborative assessment rather than hierarchical decision. Locate underground access point documented in Project Clearwater schematics. Utilize maintenance tunnels to approach tower facility from unexpected vector. Implement emergency broadcast system protocols while avoiding surface-level security deployments. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through forest canopy as they located the maintenance access point, a concrete structure camouflaged among natural rock formations, secured with padlocked steel door, showing minimal maintenance but intact operational integrity. Collins defeated the locking mechanism through techniques that suggested professional training beyond standard law enforcement procedures. The access shaft descended approximately 30 feet via metal ladder before transitioning to horizontal concrete tunnel extending toward the tower facility. Emergency lighting activated through motion sensors, suggesting operational maintenance despite abandoned appearance. The infrastructure's condition confirmed Jake's assessment from Project Clearwater documentation. These weren't abandoned Cold War relics, but maintained operational facilities supporting current activities. As they proceeded through the tunnel system, radio communications monitored through Collins's equipment revealed increasing operational urgency above ground. Rivera was implementing accelerated timeline protocols, deploying resources toward multiple targets simultaneously rather than maintaining focus on their specific location. The terminal protocol was transitioning from planning to active implementation. Potential victims identified in Nakamura's files faced imminent threat without warning or protection. Their underground approach provided temporary advantage against surface surveillance, but time constraints now represented primary operational limitation. Every minute required for their approach represented lives potentially lost through terminal protocol implementation elsewhere in the region. The maintenance tunnel terminated at access shaft beneath the fire observation tower's main structure. Collins ascended first, confirming security conditions before signaling for Ellie and Jake to follow. Shadow remained below temporarily, his canine instincts detecting something about the tower environment that triggered caution responses. The tower's observation level provided both tactical advantage and immediate concern. Glass wall design offering 360-degree visibility simultaneously exposed them to potential observation from ground-level security teams. The communication equipment they sought occupied central console position, appearing operational, but requiring authorization codes they didn't possess. Jake's technical knowledge again provided unexpected solution. The emergency broadcast system included override protocols for situations where authorized personnel might be incapacitated during critical events. The notebook contained Project Clearwater documentation, including emergency authorization codes potentially applicable to current equipment. While Jake attempted access procedures, Collins maintained security observation reporting tactical team deployments, establishing perimeter control around the tower base. Their underground approach had temporarily confused pursuers, but not eliminated the threat. Rivera's operational control now included helicopter assets approaching from eastern vectors thermal imaging, equipment capable of detecting their presence despite physical barriers. Jake's access attempts yielded unexpected results. Not merely emergency broadcast capability, but monitoring functions for all regional communication systems, including Rivera's operational channels. The tower facility functioned as communications hub for Project Clearwater activities, providing both transmission capabilities and intelligence collection opportunities they hadn't anticipated. The monitoring function revealed operational communications confirming their worst fears. Terminal protocol implementation had begun at multiple locations simultaneously. Sheriff's Department vehicles had deployed to Martha Sullivan's residence. Accidental gas leak preparations were underway at the senior center housing potential witnesses with historical knowledge. Tactical teams had established positions around community gathering locations where unfortunate structural failures would eliminate dozens of potential information sources simultaneously. Jake established emergency broadcast system access through override protocols documented in Project Clearwater materials, providing countywide communication capabilities that bypassed normal security measures. The system would transmit across all communication devices in the region: cell phones, radios, television systems, even vehicle emergency notification systems. The message required careful construction, specific enough to warn potential victims while simultaneously alerting legitimate federal authorities to criminal activities in progress. Ellie composed content focusing on immediate safety actions rather than comprehensive explanations. Evacuate specific locations, immediately avoid contact with local law enforcement, document unusual activities through secure communication channels provided in the broadcast. As Jake prepared transmission protocols, Collins reported critical security development, Rivera herself approaching the tower base with tactical team support. Her presence confirmed their location had been identified and response resources deployed accordingly. Their temporary advantage through underground approach had expired, their current position compromised beyond sustainable security parameters. Jake activated emergency broadcast transmission as helicopter sounds became audible above the tower structure. The message deployed across all regional communication systems, simultaneously warning potential victims about imminent threats, while providing documentation protocols for federal oversight authorities. The transmission included location data for Nakamura's hidden files, bunker access information, and simplified explanation of terminal protocol implementation currently underway throughout the region. Their warning delivered tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Thermal imaging from aerial assets would detect their presence within minutes. Ground teams had established comprehensive perimeter control around the tower base. Rivera's operational commands, monitored through equipment Jake had accessed, directed immediate containment with extreme prejudice. Terminology leaving no doubt about intended outcome. Jake's continued monitoring of communication systems revealed unexpected transmission, breaking through normal security protocols. FBI Assistant Director Catherine Morgan, broadcasting on emergency frequencies with direct orders countermanding Rivera's operations. Congressional oversight committees had been notified of potential crimes in progress. International monitoring stations were providing real-time surveillance of federal activities in the region. The transmission confirmed Nakamura's evidence packages had reached appropriate authorities and triggered response mechanisms beyond Project Clearwater's control capabilities. Legitimate federal authorities were responding to criminal activities that had operated without oversight for decades, establishing direct communication with field assets through emergency protocols designed specifically for situations involving compromised command structures. Rivera's response to this development, captured through tower monitoring systems, revealed desperate escalation rather than tactical withdrawal. Orders directed immediate implementation of remaining terminal protocol elements regardless of external oversight activation. Primary targets, including Ellie and Jake, remained priority objectives despite changing strategic conditions. The helicopter hovering above the tower represented both immediate threat and potential monitoring platform for legitimate federal authorities attempting to document events into real time. Their tactical position had transformed from simple survival scenario to evidence preservation requirement. They needed to remain alive long enough for external authorities to intervene against Rivera's operations. Collins implemented defensive positioning within the tower structure, utilizing architectural features for limited protection against ground team approach vectors. Jake maintained communication monitoring, providing real-time intelligence about tactical deployments and response coordination between legitimate federal authorities and Rivera's operational elements. Shadow's alert posture changed abruptly, indicating threat detection from unexpected vector. The elevator system connecting tower levels activated despite security lockdown protocols suggesting override capabilities beyond normal operational parameters. Someone was ascending toward their position using access methods that bypass standard security measures. The elevator doors opened to reveal Alexandra Rivera herself, professional appearance contradicting operational circumstances, sidearm, held with practiced confidence rather than theatrical threat. Her expression conveyed administrative annoyance rather than personal animosity, as though their interference represented scheduling inconvenience rather than existential challenge. Rivera's unexpected words cut through tactical assumptions with disturbing clarity. Mrs. Morgan, your husband caused similar complications. Administrative disruptions always require disproportionate resource allocation for resolution. The FBI tactical team secured Rivera, efficiently implementing restraint protocols while maintaining environmental awareness. Their operational discipline reflected training specifically designed for high-value subject apprehension rather than standard law enforcement procedures. The team leader established communication with the helicopter outside, coordinating response priorities between immediate tactical situation and broader regional threats. Assistant Director Morgan's voice directed resources toward documented terminal protocol targets, with emphasis on civilian protection above evidence preservation. Collins provided intelligence despite injury limitations, identifying priority locations based on Nakamura's documentation and observed tactical team deployments. Martha Sullivan's residence received immediate response prioritization, given observed Sheriff's Department activities suggesting imminent threat implementation. Rivera maintained administrative composure despite physical restraint, her expression suggesting procedural inconvenience rather than operational failure. The contingency protocols she'd activated continued implementing across regional infrastructure systematic destruction of evidence that had documented 3 decades of extra-legal operations. Jake frantically attempted counter-protocols through the communication console, preserving digital evidence fragments before destruction sequencing completed. His technical abilities proved impressive, but ultimately insufficient against systems specifically designed for comprehensive elimination of operational footprints. The FBI tactical team established secure extraction procedures, prioritizing witness protection above facility control, given ongoing destruction protocols. Morgan directed immediate evacuation to secure locations outside regional jurisdiction, recognition that local infrastructure remained compromised despite Rivera's apprehension. As they prepared for helicopter extraction, Jake's monitoring systems captured critical intelligence fragments. Before complete system collapse, the black contingency Rivera had authorized extended beyond simple evidence destruction. Emergency medical channels reported multiple accidents occurring simultaneously throughout the region, despite intervention attempts, vehicle crashes, structure fires, apparent gas leaks. The terminal protocol implementation continued through pre-established mechanisms despite command disruption. Project Clearwater's operational architecture had been designed specifically to maintain function even after leadership decapitation. Local assets continued executing elimination protocols based on contingency training rather than direct oversight. Ellie cradled Jake's head protectively as they boarded the helicopter, her eyes meeting Rivera's across the confined space. The federal agent's expression remained clinically detached, her gaze calculating rather than defeated despite the restraints securing her to the aircraft bench. This wasn't over the eyes conveyed institutional certainty rather than personal emotion. Whatever Project Clearwater represented extended beyond individuals to systems designed for operational continuity, regardless of personnel losses. The helicopter lifted off, providing aerial perspective of the destruction unfolding below. Multiple structure fires erupted across the community-targeted building rather than random distribution. Vehicle accidents blocked strategic intersections, impeding emergency response, while creating plausible environmental causation narratives. Morgan coordinated response resources through secure channels, prioritizing civilian protection while documenting connection patterns between incidents for subsequent investigation. From aerial perspective, tactical team movements became visible across multiple locations. Project Clearwater assets, continuing operations despite Rivera's apprehension and Morgan's intervention. Jake maintained desperate focus on the tablet Morgan had provided, attempting to preserve critical data fragments from systems now systematically destroying themselves across the region. His technical persistence yielded partial success, document fragments, personnel records, operational timelines preserved in fragmented form rather than complete elimination. The helicopter diverted from direct extraction route toward Martha Sullivan's residence based on Collins's intelligence about imminent threat conditions. The tactical diversion represented operational prioritization of civilian protection above witness extraction, recognition that Ellie and Jake's evidence meant nothing compared to ongoing elimination of innocent community members. Sullivan's residence appeared surrounded by Sheriff's Department vehicles personnel implementing apparent arrest procedures without standard protocol visibility. Morgan coordinated immediate intervention through tactical team deployment from the helicopter, establishing federal authority presence while documenting local law enforcement activities. The intervention created immediate jurisdictional conflict, Sheriff Cooper personally supervising operations that halted upon federal arrival. The confrontation remained procedurally contained but operationally significant, Cooper maintaining administrative professionalism while clearly implementing Project Clearwater protocols rather than legitimate law enforcement activities. Morgan established direct authority through federal identification while tactical team members secured Martha Sullivan against apparent detention attempts. The librarian appeared physically unharmed but psychologically affected, professional composure maintained despite obvious recognition of narrowly avoided elimination. Cooper's reaction revealed operational depth beyond simple corruption, professional resignation rather than resistance, administrative compliance rather than emotional response. His behavior suggested protocols specifically established for containment failure, scenarios including apparent acceptance of personal consequences in service to larger operational priorities. The helicopter resumed extraction mission with Sullivan secured alongside other witnesses, providing expanded intelligence through her extensive knowledge of community systems. Her professional information management background proved valuable beyond specific Project Clearwater knowledge, identifying documentation repositories, communication networks, and administrative systems useful for broader investigation. Morgan coordinated expanded response through secure channels, federal resources deploying across multiple regional locations simultaneously. The operational scale reflected recognition that Project Clearwater represented infrastructure compromise beyond simple criminal conspiracy, systematic integration with legitimate governmental functions, requiring comprehensive intervention rather than targeted enforcement. The senior center evacuation proceeded under federal protection, tactical teams establishing security perimeter, while medical personnel assessed residents for potential harm from interrupted elimination protocols. The intervention timing had prevented mass casualty events, but revealed operational preparations already implemented gas line manipulations, structural weakening, contamination attempts interrupted before completion. From aerial perspective, the community appeared under systematic attack infrastructure targeted through multiple vectors, simultaneously creating emergency response requirements exceeding local capabilities. The operational design demonstrated sophisticated planning specifically intended to create environmental causation narratives explaining multiple casualties without obvious connection patterns. As darkness fell across the region, the extraction helicopter approached secure federal facility outside regional jurisdiction. Jake had fallen asleep against Ellie's shoulder exhaustion, finally overcoming adrenaline after 36 hours of continuous crisis. Shadow maintained protective positioning between them and Rivera. Despite the confined aircraft space, the dog's instinctive assessment of threat priorities unchanged by changing environmental conditions. The landing zone appeared heavily secured tactical personnel, operating under direct congressional oversight rather than standard Bureau protocols. The security architecture reflected recognition of potential compromise beyond regional infrastructure, protective measures implementing against institutional penetration rather than simply local corruption. Processing procedures demonstrated unusual containment protocols. Rivera separated immediately from other personnel, subjected to specialized security measures beyond standard detention requirements. The operational response suggested classification levels exceeding normal federal procedures, potentially indicating national security implications beyond regional criminal activities. Collins received immediate medical attention, his shoulder damage requiring surgical intervention. The professional assessment included psychological evaluation given his family's apparent historical connection to Project Clearwater operations, potential conditioning or information exposure requiring specialized debriefing protocols. Martha Sullivan received protective custody arrangements exceeding standard witness parameters, including identity protection measures normally reserved for high-value intelligence assets. The security architecture reflected recognition that Project Clearwater's operational reach extended beyond regional boundaries, potential retribution capabilities requiring comprehensive protective response. Jake's technical contributions received immediate professional validation, federal cybersecurity personnel implementing specialized preservation protocols for data fragments he'd recovered from compromised systems. The operational response suggested intelligence value exceeding standard evidence, parameters potentially indicating connections to broader security architecture beyond regional operations. Morgan coordinated secure accommodation arrangements within federal protection parameters, private quarters, with enhanced security features, communication limitations, and continuous monitoring. The protective architecture resembled witness security programs, but with enhanced parameters suggesting national security protocols rather than standard criminal justice procedures. For the first time in 48 hours, Ellie allowed herself momentary relief. Jake asleep in the adjacent bed, Shadow maintaining vigilant but relaxed positioning near the door. The immediate physical danger had passed, though the psychological implications remained unprocessed. Robert's death confirmed as intentional elimination, their cabin purchase potentially manipulated through unseen forces, 3 years of life constructed around lies concealing institutional murder. Sleep arrived instantly, but provided no mental restoration, her dreams filled with bunker corridors that extended endlessly, radio transmissions from voices without faces. Rivera's administrative detachment as she calculated human elimination values against operational continuity requirements. The subconscious processing revealed psychological trauma beyond immediate threat, response recognition that foundational trust in institutional protections had been permanently compromised. Morning arrived with enhanced security protocols, armed escorts for movement within the facility, communication equipment secured under federal control debriefing procedures implemented through specialized personnel trained for trauma-informed intelligence collection. The operational architecture suggested expectations of extended protective custody rather than temporary witness housing. Morgan conducted initial debriefing personally, establishing secure environment for comprehensive intelligence collection while maintaining witness protection protocols. The operational approach balanced immediate evidence preservation requirements against psychological support needs, recognition that trauma exposure created both investigative complications and ethical responsibilities. Jake demonstrated remarkable resilience despite psychological pressure, maintaining technical focus on data recovery and analysis rather than emotional response to traumatic exposure. His continued contribution provided critical intelligence components, encryption patterns within recovered fragments, suggesting communication architecture, connecting Project Clearwater to other implementation nodes across multiple jurisdictions. Martha Sullivan's professional knowledge contributed crucial contextual understanding, Historical patterns identified through library records revealing population anomalies consistent with elimination protocols implementing periodically over decades rather than isolated incidents. The statistical analysis suggested systematic processing of security threats beyond the documented families from 1993, potentially dozens of additional eliminations disguised as accidents, relocations, or natural causes. Collins provided operational perspective through law enforcement experience, identifying procedural anomalies within regional agencies consistent with systematic compromise rather than individual corruption. The pattern recognition suggested institutional penetration, implementing through professional training systems, budget allocations, and personnel selection criteria rather than simply bribery or intimidation of existing authorities. Through collective intelligence contribution, operational understanding crystallized beyond initial assessment. Project Clearwater, representing implementation node within program architecture, operating without formal designation or authorization, yet functioning within governmental infrastructure. The organizational structure utilized legitimate resources, personnel, and authorities while implementing extra-legal operations without formal accountability or oversight. Morgan's response to this emerging intelligence reflected institutional concern beyond normal criminal investigation parameters, specialized security protocols implementing for all witnesses regardless of specific knowledge or involvement levels. The protective architecture suggested potential retribution capabilities exceeding normal threat assessment, institutional resources potentially deployable against federal protective custody despite Rivera's containment. As initial debriefing concluded, Morgan provided preliminary operational assessment with professional clarity. We've identified similar implementation nodes in 7 states currently. Each operates with regional autonomy but connected infrastructure. Rivera represents operational management rather than organizational leadership, executing protocols established at levels we haven't yet identified. The assessment confirmed Ellie's growing recognition that their survival represented temporary tactical success rather than strategic victory. Rivera's apprehension impacting operational capability without addressing fundamental organizational architecture. The program apparently continued functioning despite individual node compromise, potentially implementing countermeasures beyond current protective capabilities. Secure facility arrangements reflected this ongoing threat assessment. Comprehensive security protocols implementing for all witnesses, including restricted communication channels, continuous surveillance, and isolation from external contact. The protective measures resembled witness security programs, but with enhanced parameters suggesting national security protocols rather than standard criminal justice procedures. Days extended into weeks as investigation expanded beyond regional boundaries to multiple jurisdictions, revealing systematic pattern of extra-legal operations implementing through compromised governmental infrastructure across rural communities nationwide. Congressional oversight committees established specialized investigative authorities bypassing normal bureaucratic channels potentially compromised by program penetration. Jake adapted to secure facility restrictions with remarkable flexibility, converting technical limitations into creative challenges rather than imprisonment constraints. Federal cybersecurity personnel provided specialized training opportunities appropriate to his abilities while maintaining age-appropriate developmental support. Recognition that his contributions represented valuable intelligence capabilities despite chronological immaturity. Shadow received specialized service animal certification through federal protocols, allowing continued companionship despite secure facility restrictions normally prohibiting animals. The certification reflected recognition of both psychological support benefits and tactical security advantages, canine sensory capabilities, providing detection functions exceeding technological measures in certain operational environments. Martha Sullivan's professional background proved increasingly valuable as investigation expanded her information. Management expertise facilitating pattern recognition across seemingly unrelated documentation. The analytical capabilities exceeded standard investigative techniques, identifying operational signatures, connecting disparate incidents across multiple jurisdictions and decades. Collins underwent extensive psychological assessment following shoulder reconstruction, the evaluation revealing potential generational conditioning through family connection to Project Clearwater operations. The psychological architecture suggested sophisticated recruitment methodologies implementing through childhood development manipulation rather than adult recruitment, potential explanation for operational continuity across decades despite personnel transitions. Rivera remained detained under specialized protocols, exceeding standard federal custody parameters, her interrogation producing minimal operational intelligence despite advanced techniques. The resistance pattern suggested psychological conditioning beyond normal loyalty considerations, potentially neurological modifications specifically designed to prevent intelligence compromise under interrogation conditions. 3 months into protective custody, Morgan provided updated operational assessment through secure briefing procedures. The investigation had expanded to 15 identified nodes across 12 states, each demonstrating similar operational architecture despite regional variations. The pattern suggested nationwide implementation structure operating through rural jurisdictions specifically selected for limited oversight capabilities in vulnerable authority structures. Congressional hearings proceeded through specialized security protocols, testimony provided through secure transmission rather than physical presence. The procedural architecture reflected continuing threat assessment despite federal protective measures recognition that program operational capabilities potentially extended to legislative processes through compromised personnel or infrastructure. Public narrative development presented unique challenges beyond standard witness protection requirements. 3 families publicly deceased for 30 years couldn't simply reappear without creating conspiracy narratives potentially undermining legitimate investigation. The public relations architecture required careful balancing between transparency requirements and operational security considerations. Truth revealed without compromising ongoing investigation or witness security. The memorial planning process began through specialized committees operating under federal oversight, design specifications reflecting both commemorative requirements and security considerations. The architectural planning included both physical structures, acknowledging historical victims, and operational mechanisms facilitating ongoing investigation, evidence collection opportunities disguised within ceremonial functions. 6 months after their emergency extraction from the observation tower, preliminary memorial designs received approval through congressional oversight committees. Construction planning proceeded through specialized contractors operating under federal security clearance, material sourcing, and personnel management implementing through protocols designed to prevent operational penetration. Morgan approached Ellie with conditional proposal that simultaneously acknowledged ongoing security concerns and recognized psychological health requirements, temporary secure facility, departure under comprehensive protection for memorial dedication and attendance. The operational parameters included extensive security measures disguised within ceremonial architecture, tactical personnel positioned as attendees, surveillance countermeasures integrated within ceremonial equipment, extraction protocols prepared for immediate implementation if threat conditions changed. Jake received the proposal with characteristic analytical assessment, focusing on technical aspects rather than emotional considerations. The operational analysis reflected his accelerated maturity beyond chronological development, security vulnerability assessment conducted with professional precision despite adolescent emotional processing. His conclusion balanced risk assessment against psychological benefits, controlled exposure, representing acceptable compromise between absolute security and necessary psychological processing. Martha Sullivan's participation received specialized security planning beyond standard protection protocols, her public position as interim sheriff creating unique vulnerability concerns. The operational architecture included both visible security measures, appropriate to official function, and concealed protective assets positioned through specialized deployment protocols. The comprehensive approach reflected recognition of Sullivan's symbolic importance within community healing process, while acknowledging continuing threat assessment. The memorial dedication ceremony represented both symbolic acknowledgement and practical intelligence operation, public recognition of historical crimes while establishing visible federal presence within community previously controlled through compromised local authorities. The ceremonial architecture included comprehensive security measures disguised within event protocols, protective deployment ensuring witness safety during temporary secure facility departure. The granite monument established permanent physical record where previously only hidden documentation had existed, names of confirmed victims carved into institutional memory rather than concealed behind administrative euphemisms. The Nakamura Reyes and Blackwell families received public acknowledgement 3 decades after their processing through Project Clearwater protocols. Daniel Nakamura received posthumous recognition through memorial inclusion, his 30 years of resistance against institutional terrorism acknowledged despite personal compromises required for survival. The historical narrative included his crucial role in evidence preservation that ultimately enabled program exposure documentation maintained through decades of surveillance and intimidation. Robert Morgan's name appeared among recognized victims, his environmental consulting work acknowledged as triggering factor for elimination decision rather than accidental death. The public recognition provided partial closure for both Ellie and Jake. Grief processes previously complicated by uncertainty now focused through confirmed knowledge despite continuing pain. Martha Sullivan addressed the gathering through carefully constructed remarks, balancing public information requirements against ongoing investigation limitations. Her professional communication skills provided community reassurance while maintaining operational security, truth acknowledged without compromising continuing investigation or protective security measures. The memorial location constructed near the bunker site that had initiated their discovery included subtle security features beyond ceremonial requirements. Surveillance countermeasures, emergency response protocols, and tactical positioning options had been integrated within landscape architecture. Recognition that public ceremony created potential vulnerability despite comprehensive protection measures. Ellie observed the ceremony with complex emotional response relief at public acknowledgement of crimes previously hidden, concern about ongoing threat assessment despite institutional intervention, hope for community healing despite traumatic revelations. The psychological balance reflected realistic assessment rather than naive closure, recognition that justice remained incomplete despite significant progress toward accountability. Jake participated with unusual maturity for his 13 years, the experiences of recent months accelerating developmental trajectory beyond chronological benchmarks. His technical contributions to ongoing investigation had received professional recognition. Beyond age-appropriate acknowledgement, specialized recruitment approaches already implementing from multiple agencies despite parental protective concerns. As ceremonial proceedings concluded, Morgan provided operational update within secure parameters, Rivera's prosecution proceeding through specialized judicial channels, evidence preservation continuing despite systematic destruction attempts, investigation expanding to additional jurisdictional nodes identified through intelligence collection. The professional assessment maintained balanced perspective between progress acknowledgement and ongoing threat recognition, institutional penetration, continuing despite individual node compromise. The ceremony's conclusion triggered immediate security protocol, activation, departure procedures, implementing through predetermined sequences designed to minimize vulnerability during transition between protected environments. The operational architecture reflected continuing threat assessment despite public accountability progress. Program capabilities potentially extending beyond identified operational nodes to uncompromised resources. Their return to secure federal facility occurred without incident, though Shadow's increased alertness during transport suggested potential surveillance beyond normal civilian observation. The behavioral indicators remained below confirmation threshold, but reinforced ongoing threat assessment, potential monitoring representing intelligence gathering rather than immediate intervention threat. 2 weeks after memorial dedication, Morgan presented revised security assessment with significant operational implications. Investigation progress had identified additional program nodes, but simultaneously created increased visibility within compromised systems. The expanded federal investigation potentially triggering contingency protocols within remaining operational architecture. The security recalculation recommended permanent relocation under enhanced identity protection rather than continued secure facility residence. The static protection environment creating vulnerability through predictability despite comprehensive security measures. The operational assessment suggested distributed security architecture implementing through specialized identity construction rather than centralized protective containment. The relocation proposal included comprehensive protection architecture disguised within normal civilian infrastructure, new identities constructed with specialized background, integration residence selection, implementing through tactical assessment rather than personal preference employment arrangements facilitated through secure channels, maintaining professional qualification transfer while establishing legitimate community presence. Jake received the proposal with characteristic analytical assessment, evaluating operational parameters rather than emotional displacement considerations. The developmental response reflected continuing maturation acceleration beyond chronological benchmarks, adult-level security analysis implemented through adolescent psychological framework with remarkable integration between conflicting processing requirements. Martha Sullivan's parallel relocation, implementing through different operational parameters, her public position creating unique security requirements beyond standard witness protection architecture. The specialized protocols included both professional continuity measures and enhanced protective monitoring recognition that her symbolic importance created targeting profile requiring customized security solutions. Collins declined parallel relocation opportunity, requesting assignment within specialized federal task force, investigating remaining program architecture. The operational decision reflected professional evolution beyond psychological conditioning, active opposition against institutional corruption, despite generational connection to compromised operational structures. The relocation processing included identity protection measures beyond standard witness, security parameters, comprehensive background construction, historical documentation integration, and professional qualification transfer implementing through specialized federal resources. The security architecture reflected recognition that normal protective measures remain vulnerable to program penetration, institutional capabilities requiring exceptional countermeasures. Their new residents selected through specialized security assessment rather than personal preference included comprehensive protective measures disguised within normal architectural features. Surveillance countermeasures, emergency response protocols, and tactical advantage considerations had informed selection process beyond comfort or convenience parameters. Shadow adapted to new environmental conditions with professional flexibility training, repurposed for suburban security requirements rather than mountain terrain. The animal's protective capabilities remain crucial component within security architecture. Sensory advantages providing early warning functions beyond technological measures. Jake's educational arrangements balanced security requirements against developmental needs, specialized distance learning protocols, implementing through secure channels, while maintaining age-appropriate socialization through carefully assessed interaction opportunities. The educational architecture reflected recognition that isolation created psychological vulnerability despite physical protection benefits. Ellie's professional transition included identity protection measures integrated within qualification documentation, firefighting and emergency response certifications transferred through specialized channels while maintaining security protocols. The occupational architecture provided both practical income requirements and psychological continuity benefits, professional identity maintained despite comprehensive life disruption. The evidence preservation trust Ellie maintained represented practical security measure beyond psychological contingency documentation secured through multiple redundant systems, ensuring information survival, regardless of individual protection failures. The security architecture reflected realistic assessment of ongoing threat despite institutional intervention recognition that program operational capabilities potentially extended beyond currently identified parameters. Morgan maintained secure communication through specialized channels, providing investigation updates without compromising relocated witness security. The operational architecture included both technical security measures preventing transmission interception and content security protocols limiting potentially compromising information transfer. The communication balance reflected continuing threat assessment despite geographical separation from primary investigation centers. 1 month after relocation implementation, Morgan provided critical investigation update through Secure Channel. Rivera's holding facility had experienced comprehensive security breach, resulting in multiple casualties. The operational report included minimal details, but confirmed essential assessment. Rivera's current status unknown, presumed extraction rather than elimination, based on operational patterns and resource allocation evidence. The security implications triggered immediate protocol enhancement without geographical relocation, maintaining established identity architecture while implementing additional protective measures through specialized technical and behavioral modifications. The security balance reflected operational assessment that location security hadn't been compromised, despite Rivera's potential extraction containment breach, representing targeted operation rather than identity exposure. 3 months after Rivera's apparent extraction investigation progress provided partial confirmation through intelligence collection from compromised program node in adjacent state. Operational documentation suggested Rivera's extraction, implementing through contingency protocols established specifically for leadership preservation, rather than operational continuity, her value apparently exceeding standard personnel considerations despite operational failure. The intelligence suggested organizational architecture extending beyond previously identified operational parameters. Program leadership potentially implementing through institutional integration, exceeding federal investigation capabilities. The structural assessment indicated potential penetration of oversight mechanisms designed to provide accountability, comprehensive corruption, architecture potentially neutralizing traditional checks and balances through systematic compromise. Congressional Oversight Committee proceedings continued through specialized security protocols testimony and evidence collection implementing through protective measures designed to minimize witness exposure while maximizing information transmission. The procedural architecture reflected recognition that legitimate governmental functions remain vulnerable to program penetration despite growing awareness of operational mechanisms. 6 months after relocation implementation, Jake's continued technical contributions through secure channels received specialized recognition beyond chronological expectations. Federal agencies implementing age-appropriate recruitment pathways despite parental reservations. The professional acknowledgement included both current contribution value and potential development trajectory recognition that his capabilities represented valuable intelligence asset beyond simple witness status. Ellie maintained careful balance between protective security measures and psychological health requirements, necessary vigilance without paranoia-inducing hypervigilance that would create quality-of-life disruption. The psychological approach reflected professional assessment of sustainable security implementation, recognition that excessive protective measures created vulnerability through isolation and behavioral abnormality that would potentially identify their protected status. Their final evening conversation reflected balanced perspective rather than artificial closure acknowledgement of continuing challenges despite significant progress toward justice and accountability. Jake's observation captured this complex reality with premature wisdom. They caught Rivera, but not everyone behind her. We're safer, but not completely safe. Maybe that's just how it works better, but not perfect. Ellie's response balanced maternal protection instinct against factual accuracy, acknowledging ongoing threat assessment while providing appropriate psychological support. Sometimes justice takes longer than we want. But what you did, what we all did, matters. People know the truth now. That's something they can't take back, no matter what happens next. As night settled around their new residence, Shadow maintained customary security position near Jake's bedroom door. Protective instincts neither diminished by environmental changes nor elevated by hypervigilance. The animal's balanced response reflected optimal security approach, appropriate caution without psychological paralysis. Through darkened window-passing vehicle lights briefly illuminated interior spaces before continuing along suburban street. The momentary illumination revealed ordinary domestic scene board games on coffee table, school books on desk, family photographs on walls. Normal life reconstructed within extraordinary circumstances, resilience manifesting through deliberate ordinariness, despite continued extraordinary threats. Outside beyond security, perimeter. Invisible to casual observation, unmarked vehicle maintained surveillance position without operational signature. The monitoring presence represented neither immediate threat nor protective measure, uncertain classification reflecting continuing reality that some program operational capabilities remained unidentified despite significant exposure. The ambiguous conclusion reflected realistic assessment rather than artificial narrative resolution, acknowledgement that institutional penetration extended beyond individual operational nodes to systematic compromise requiring comprehensive rather than isolated response. Justice remained incomplete, accountability, partial safety, relative rather than absolute. Yet within this ambiguity existed meaningful progress, Truth exposed despite systematic concealment, accountability, established despite institutional resistance, healing begun despite traumatic revelation. The memorial stood where secrecy had previously dominated. Names acknowledged where erasure had been implemented. History recorded where falsification had been standard procedure. Shadow's ears briefly oriented toward distant sound before relaxing again. Threat assessment completed with professional efficiency, potential concern, evaluated and dismissed through trained instinct. The momentary alertness followed by a return to baseline vigilance represented optimal security approach, appropriate caution without hypervigilance paralysis. As Ellie completed final security verification before sleep, her reflection captured balanced perspective beyond artificial resolution. Sometimes victory looks like survival with evidence preserved. Sometimes justice begins with truth exposed rather than punishment completed. Sometimes the most important triumph is simply refusing to disappear when systems of power have determined you should. The knowledge that Rivera remained active somewhere within opaque institutional structures created unavoidable psychological tension, but not debilitating fear. Whatever program architecture remained operational after their exposure efforts, whatever contingency protocols continued implementing through compromised governmental systems, they had accomplished what Robert Agent Wilson and Daniel Nakamura had died attempting. Truth recorded. Evidence preserved. History acknowledged. Justice begun, if not completed. Their new life continued beneath deliberate ordinariness. School assignments, professional responsibilities, neighborhood interactions, all constructed through careful balance between necessary security measures and psychological health requirements. The daily patterns represented not surrender to continuing threat, but defiance against intended elimination existence itself, becoming resistance against systems designed to erase inconvenient witnesses. Morgan's occasional communications through secure channels provided both practical security updates and psychological continuity connection to accountability processes without compromising identity protection measures. The operational balance reflected recognition that complete isolation created psychological vulnerability despite enhancing physical security, human connection representing necessary component within comprehensive protection architecture. The investigation continued expanding through specialized federal resources, identifying additional program nodes across multiple jurisdictions, while documenting operational methodologies implementing through compromised governmental structures. The progress represented institutional learning beyond individual accountability, systemic vulnerabilities identified through exposure despite continuing operational activity within unidentified components. Tomorrow would bring ordinary challenges disguised within extraordinary circumstances, maintaining identity security through daily interactions, balancing vigilance against paranoia, constructing meaningful life despite artificial foundations. The future contained both continuing threat potential and healing possibilities. Justice processes implementing through legitimate governmental functions despite institutional corruption within parallel structures. As sleep approached, Ellie's final conscious thought acknowledged both continuing danger and remarkable victory. They had survived a system designed specifically for their elimination, preserved evidence intended for destruction, initiated accountability processes against operations designed to prevent oversight. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever program components remained operational, whatever threat assessment continued implementing, through protection protocols, they had already accomplished what 3 families, 1 federal agent, and countless unknown others had died attempting. They had refused to disappear when systems of power had determined they should not exist.